December 2006, Britain quietly wired the United States an $83 million payment. No ceremony, no speeches, just a transfer. But that payment closed a story most people never learn. Britain was still paying for World War II more than 6 decades after the victory parades ended. And here's the part that changes how you see modern power. The debt wasn't a thank you bill for winning the war. It was the admission fee for being allowed to keep fighting. While bombs fell on London and U-boats hunted the Atlantic, the lifeline across the ocean came with a price tag. Cash-first rules, forced asset sales, long-term base leases, and legal clauses that reshaped the British Empire itself. The popular version is simple. America helped an ally defeat tyranny. The real version is colder. Crisis created leverage, leverage created terms, and those terms moved gold, markets, influence, and control from London to Washington, fast. This isn't just World War II history. It's a blueprint for how modern empires expand without marching armies into capitals. They do it with contracts, liquidity, bottlenecks, and debt, especially when allies are desperate. Now let's walk through exactly how it happened. Before the war, Britain didn't look like a nation about to beg. It looked like the center of the world's financial bloodstream. London sat at the top of global credit. Overseas investments threw off income from railways, mines, plantations, shipping, and oil concessions. The pound still carried global prestige. The empire wasn't just flags and maps. It was a trading architecture that steered demand toward British industry. Then war arrived and something brutal happened. Britain had to buy survival at industrial scale. Aircraft, fuel, steel, trucks, ammunition, an endless list that Britain could not produce fast enough. And the one country with the factories and distance to supply it was the United States. Britain's problem wasn't courage or strategy. It was math. A modern war burns capital like a furnace. Imports explode, insurance costs rise, shipping losses grow, foreign exchange drains. And when you're paying in hard currency, every order is a withdrawal from a finite vault. So Britain entered the conflict with global assets, but a wartime cash flow crisis that turned those assets into collateral. That distinction, wealth on paper versus cash in hand, decided everything that followed. America's early neutrality wasn't passive. It was structured. Under the cash and carry rules, Britain could buy supplies, but only if it paid up front and transported goods itself. No credit, no friendly tab, no delayed settlement. Pay first, sail second. That sounds like standard business until you picture the timing. Britain was ordering under fire. Britain's ships were being sunk. Britain's reserves were draining. And the United States was effectively saying, the factories are here, the goods are here, but the door opens only when cash hits the table. This forced Britain to liquidate fast. Gold and securities were moved abroad, not as a precaution, but as a payment mechanism. It wasn't only about protecting bullion from invasion. It was about turning national reserves into purchasing power in dollars. By late 1940, the situation turned from tight to impossible. Britain was still signing contracts, still requesting equipment, still bleeding ships and material, yet the dollars to pay were running out. That's the moment people call help arriving. But what arrived first wasn't help. It was negotiation over what Britain still owned and what it would be forced to sell. The public explanation of lend-lease was emotionally perfect. Lend your neighbor a hose when his house is burning. But the real arrangement was not charity. It was leverage converted into paperwork. Behind the scenes, the logic was transactional. If Britain had valuable assets, those assets should be consumed before American taxpayers carried the burden. That principle sounds defensible until you remember the setting. Britain was fighting for its existence, and the terms were being written by the side that controlled the supply tap. So the first demand wasn't a speech about freedom, it was a financial inventory. What does the British state own? What do British citizens own? What can be sold quickly? What can be pledged? What can be surrendered in exchange for continued flow? That requirement matters because it reframes everything. It wasn't, here's support, we'll settle later. It was, prove you're empty, then we'll talk. And once you force a distressed party to sell, you guarantee the worst pricing. Buyers know the seller has no choice. Fees rise. Bargains get ruthless. The stronger side calls it markets. The weaker side experiences it as extraction, because it happens under time pressure with no alternative supplier. When a powerful nation needs assets, it doesn't always invade. Sometimes it waits for a crisis, then buys the assets cheap while the owner is panicking. That's what forced liquidation looks like. A valuable company, a long-built portfolio, strategic holdings, sold fast, not because it's smart, but because the alternative is collapse. The buyer side knows this and prices accordingly. During the war, Britain was pushed to convert long-term holdings into immediate dollars. This wasn't a slow strategic rebalancing. It was a sell-off under pressure. And when you sell under pressure, you don't get full value. You get what the market offers when it smells blood. That is how decades of accumulated overseas wealth can move in months. It's also how the post-war order can be shaped before the war even ends. Because once those assets are gone, future income streams are gone too. Dividends vanish. Influence weakens. Industrial recovery becomes harder. After the shooting stops, the balance sheet stays broken. This is why wartime financing is never just wartime financing. It's a claim on the future. It decides who owns the factories, who controls the trade routes, who holds the reserves, and who writes the rules afterward. Financial extraction wasn't the only channel. Geography was traded too. Britain needed naval capability fast, especially to counter submarines in the Atlantic. The United States offered old destroyers, but the exchange wasn't equal in strategic value. Britain granted long-term leases on bases across key points in the Western Hemisphere and Atlantic corridor. That's not a simple swap of ships for land. That's an infrastructure upgrade for American power projection, built into a contract that lasted generations. Think of what bases do. They extend range, they control sea lanes, they enable logistics, patrol, refueling, and rapid deployment. In modern geopolitics, bases are the skeleton of influence. So Britain, under immediate threat, effectively pawned strategic access for short-term relief. This is how a superpower loses position without losing a battle. It signs away the map in exchange for time. And once that map changes hands, it rarely returns. Because the side that acquires the infrastructure doesn't treat it as temporary. It treats it as the foundation for the next era. Britain was buying weeks and months. America was buying a platform that would outlive the war and reshape the post-war balance. Some of the most important terms in history don't look threatening on paper. One clause pushed Britain toward dismantling the trade system that kept the empire economically coherent. That system, preferential access and protected markets, wasn't merely political. It was the commercial glue that directed demand toward British goods and preserved industrial relevance. Now place yourself in Britain's position. You're fighting a total war. You need supplies immediately. You sign what's put in front of you, and buried in the agreement is a future commitment. After the war, you will open markets, remove preference systems, and allow full competition. That sounds like modern free trade language, but in practice it meant Britain would face American industrial competition inside the very markets that had sustained Britain's export machine. The result is predictable. During the war, Britain stops exporting to focus on weapons. After the war, its old customers have new suppliers. Its protected lanes are now contested. Its industrial base is exhausted. Its reserves are thin. So the clause doesn't destroy Britain overnight. It sets the conditions for a slow exit from economic dominance, written while Britain had no leverage to refuse. The war ends, and the weaker side expects a transition, a handoff, a ramp down, time to retool factories, rebuild trade, and restart civilian production. Instead, the tap shuts fast. This is where the emotional shock mattered as much as the financial impact. Britain assumed the supply mechanism would continue through the first phase of recovery, but sudden termination forced Britain into immediate crisis. Importing food and raw materials became difficult without dollars, and the domestic economy was not yet reconfigured for peacetime exports. That created a corner: either default, ration harder, or beg for a new arrangement. And this is the central dynamic of post-crisis power. Once the dependency is built, the supplier can dictate the reset terms. The war may be over, but the leverage doesn't disappear. It intensifies. because the dependent party is exhausted, broke, and politically vulnerable. So Britain moved from wartime survival to peacetime survival, and the negotiating table looked the same: access in exchange for concessions. That's how a conflict ends, but the extraction continues. The battlefield goes quiet. The contract language becomes the weapon. Britain's request after the cutoff wasn't about comfort. It was about avoiding collapse. But the offer wasn't framed as gratitude. It was framed as a loan with conditions. The most damaging condition involved the pound's convertibility. On the surface, convertibility sounds like normal finance. A currency should be exchangeable. In reality, timing matters more than principle. During the war, sterling balances accumulated around the world. Many holders wanted dollars because America's goods, industrial output, and post-war dominance made dollars the most desired claim on real products. So forcing convertibility at that moment was like opening a floodgate. The instant the window opened, holders rushed to convert pounds to dollars. Britain's reserves bled out rapidly. And when reserves vanish, you lose control of your currency and your trade. Britain had to suspend convertibility shortly after, humiliated, weaker, and with a chunk of the loan burned simply to survive the rush. This is how conditions can be more powerful than the loan itself. The money keeps you alive. The terms decide who owns your options. Financial weakness becomes strategic weakness quickly. When you can't afford overseas commitments, you don't just lose influence, you leave openings. Britain had long played gatekeeper roles in key regions, but post-war finances made those roles unsustainable. When Britain signaled it could no longer carry certain burdens, the United States stepped in. That wasn't simply generosity, it was succession. And succession is the point. Global leadership isn't only taken by force. It's inherited when the previous holder can't pay the bill anymore. Once the shift happens, it becomes self-reinforcing. Allies reorient, military planning changes, financial flows follow the new center, trade invoicing adapts, the reserve system tilts. The old power becomes a participant in a system it once managed. So Britain's decline wasn't just about repayment checks. It was about the long arc, from global creditor and system designer to constrained actor operating under the shadow of a stronger partner. That's the real lesson. Debt and dependency don't merely cost money. They move decision-making authority, quietly, legally, permanently. This story isn't valuable because it's dramatic. It's valuable because it repeats. The pattern looks like this. An ally faces a crisis. The dominant power controls the bottleneck: money, weapons, energy, logistics, settlement rails. Support is offered, but not as a blank check. It's offered as structured assistance with requirements. Those requirements can be market access, base rights, policy alignment, asset sales, or reserve holdings. Sometimes it's subtle: standardization, reform, stability. Sometimes it's explicit: open your markets, change your rules, host the infrastructure. The result is the same. The ally survives the immediate danger, but exits with reduced independence. The dominant power exits with expanded footprint: financial, military, and commercial. That's why World War II isn't only history. It's a case study in modern empire maintenance, done through contracts and controlled dependencies rather than direct conquest. If you want to Britain didn't lose the empire in one dramatic moment. It lost it in stages: cash-first financing, distressed asset sales, strategic base leases, post-war market clauses, and loans with conditions that weakened the pound at the worst possible time. The final payments decades later were just the echo of the real transfer: gold, markets, influence, and autonomy shifting across the Atlantic, while the public was told it was all friendship. This isn't about blaming a country. It's about understanding the machinery of power. When a crisis hits and supply lines become life or death, the side controlling the tap doesn't need to invade. It can rewrite the future with paperwork. And if you're watching the world right now, rising debt, sanction regimes, currency realignment, military basing, and allies quietly reshuffling trade, you're seeing the same logic at work. If you want more breakdowns like this,